Hey, welcome to Just Salvos. This week we are having another great opportunity to talk to one of Australia's leading charity and welfare and advocacy organisations today. We've got the CEO of an amazing organisation, it's the Red Cross, and the CEO, of course, is Mr. Robert Tickner. Robert, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Maybe you could start with the easy stuff. For those of us who don't know what the Red Cross does, or maybe the detail of what the Red Cross does, fill us in.
Well, I think the first point to make is that Red Cross in Australia is part of a global humanitarian movement, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Federation, with 186 organisations just like Australian Red Cross in almost every country in the world. We're also, of course, closely linked with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has that crucial role in times of armed conflict around the world. But here in Australia, we're an organisation in huge transformation. We've moved from what were essentially 8 separate Red Cross organisations in every state and territory to a cohesive national organisation, and that's given us an enormously enhanced strength and capacity. Second thing we've done is have a real rethink, if you like, and holding a mirror up to our organisation to ask the tough questions about whether or not we're targeting the most vulnerable people, which is our mission. That's led us to a total refocus of some of our core areas while maintaining some of our traditional focus. But it's meant, for example, that for the first time, I say, with a degree of sadness, for the first time really in almost 100 years, Red Cross now has as one of its main priorities to work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, just by way of example. To round it off, we really are an Australia-wide organisation from Broome, Tennant Creek, Ceduna, capital cities, 30 regional offices. We're very focused on our community services here in Australia. We run the blood service for the people of Australia, and we have a very significant international program as well. So keeping all those balls in the air,
a bit difficult.
My job.
You mentioned the refocusing and looking at the most vulnerable groups in our community. You mentioned one of those, Indigenous Australians. What other groups have come up on your radar as being in that most vulnerable category?
Well, I think an important point to make is that Red Cross is quite strategic about the areas that it goes into. So, for example, we don't seek to be a provider of accommodation for homeless people, because we know there are lots of organisations, including the Salvation Army, which operate very effectively in that space. So we look to see where there are gaps, we look to see where we can cooperate with other not-for-profits. But having said that, there are some areas which are around the world a core part of Red Cross work. So our focus on the position of refugees and asylum seekers is one example of that focus on particularly vulnerable people. But our programs, of course, include programs for the aged, for disadvantaged, marginalised young people, and they're quite extensive right across the country. But the refugee and asylum seeker area is a space where we've played, I think, a constructive and important role running that community detention program, helping get some almost 2,000 young and vulnerable people out of detention centres and living in the community. There's some examples of our focus.
Really, important work in that particular space. Just focusing in on refugees and asylum seekers, particularly asylum seekers at the moment, what is your take? Where to from here? How do we guide the nation into a more humane policy for asylum seekers?
Well, that's a lovely question and a beautiful form of words. The first point to make is that Red Cross is neutral, we're impartial, we don't get involved in politics, but by the same token, we are not mute either. There are some areas where we have a duty to speak. And so, for example, in our work in international humanitarian law, it's an area where Red Cross needs to speak out, whether it's around the use of nuclear weapons or whatever. In the refugee space, it's also an area where we have a constructive role to play, as difficult as it is in the current public policy debate within this country. What I would say to you is that the decision of the High Court to essentially strike down the suggestion of Malaysian processing, followed by the impasse in the Parliament, has meant that for all practical purposes, as a nation, we have to deal with onshore processing. Now, what I've said in public before, and I say again, that gives this country and its political leaders on all sides of the Parliament an opportunity for a fresh start. We are a rich country by international standards. We are a country with enormous capacity. And I also hope that we're a country with an enormous heart. And I think that most Australians are, very principled people. And our surveys show that there's a lot of sympathy out there for refugees and asylum seekers. So what I say is, let's make this onshore processing work. Let's get people living in the community. There are proven programs started under the former government, the Howard government, continued under this government, which are proven solutions to allow people a much more humane existence than being in a detention centre. We can make this work.
It's actually quite inspiring to hear you say that, and so directly. We might come back and have a talk about that in just 1 minute. We're going to have a quick look at a clip that you've brought along with you, though, and we'll be back right after this.
What a problem where we fella identify him time or come teach him we fella just find him out that staka people we fella garem malaria staka or garem diarrhea because we fella no garem proper sanitation. So time or come in or teach him we fella just take him new experience and we fella survey about him live a healthy life and we fella recognize him what now unhygienic and hygiene. Every family must get a proper toilet. Even if I try hard this time for, we must build him up water tank for storing water. And even me looking whole community and clean. And change to my sister. Or the pigs and even or the animals or the roam around or the villages, even or the across or the source on top of the water and or the maybe or the dropping of the waste matter and something. So that one is causing sickness in the community too. For area where we looking this whole program and changing community we fella get used for we fella work together. For cleaning water surroundings, even digging water hole for rubbish dump, and even people helping each other for digging water toilet. Action speaks louder than word. So if me fellow people or community will continue on doing what work where or the new generation or to come up and or to looking by or to follow same something where we follow the big man this time we follow the dream and me hopefully by this whole program by no sabi end lo this whole community by everyone or the picking is we follow or the big up but to continue doing same something. And now one for area where
Very insightful clip there from the Red Cross. Now, we were talking about asylum seekers, and your emphasis on international work obviously helps give you your perspective on asylum seekers coming into our country. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what was behind that clip?
Well, I think that it gives a window, if you like, into some of our work internationally. People sometimes think that Red Cross has a focus just on emergencies. And while we are clearly a leader internationally and in Australia in that space, we are very focused as well on programs for development of communities, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. So we are very proud of the fact that our focus places a lot of reliance on the development and building of the capacity of the local Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies, because at the end of the day, these programs have got to be sustainable. And in the same way that Australians wouldn't want, people from the rest of the world essentially controlling our lives for an indeterminate time into the future, people in other countries are the same. They want to run their affairs. They want to be able to be self-reliant. And so a lot of our work is building up the capacity of the local Red Cross, Red Crescent organisations, and in turn through them the resilience and capacity of local communities.
And it's acknowledging that local communities do have capacity.
Absolutely.
That actually they don't actually need us, but need to have some of that transition work happen.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really important point, that we shouldn't get into the position where we think that, an aid organisation from Australia or from anywhere working in another country is on its own about turning the tide of human history. It's got to be the local people ultimately who play that role. We can support, we can help resource, but very importantly, we've got to build their capacity so that change is sustainable and they can be ultimately self-reliant.
I want to talk, Chris, but I just want to talk about how we alleviate poverty long term, particularly in context of extreme poverty internationally. Of course, emergencies, disasters happen, and that obviously throws a big spanner in the works. But when that doesn't happen, when we do have capacity to work long term with communities, can we alleviate poverty just from working on the ground, or is there major structural change that needs to happen as well from above?
Well, the first point to make, I guess, is that in a short interview, I'm not sure I can give you the solution to world poverty.
Come on.
Well, now where did I put that? But I think the emphasis of the global community on the Millennium Development Goals has been an important strategic objective, and of course, in some cases, we've fallen significantly short of that. But nonetheless, the principles in the Millennium Development Goals, I think, are extraordinarily important. The reasons why countries find themselves in particular circumstances are often, enmeshed in history and global politics. That's not an area Red Cross, I guess, wants to really become a commentator about. Our focus is a much more practical one, and certainly the global Red Cross, Red Crescent movement sees poverty as a major issue which impacts not only on people's daily lives, but in some ways even more significantly when there's a disaster. If a country is impoverished, it makes it extremely difficult to, for example, in an earthquake zone, have quality of buildings that are going to sustain, are going to be still in place after an earthquake. It makes feeding the population difficult, etc., etc. So there's an interconnection here between the poverty and development issues and, of course, the crisis that a natural disaster creates. We focus on both, and ideally, of course, in the longer term, building the capacity of those countries, of those communities, is the objective of, I think, most aid not-for-profit organisations, with real credibility. That's the focus, lifting that local capacity.
We need to finish up soon, but if you can tell us just briefly, we picked up already about your work with Indigenous Australians and maybe a renewed focus on Indigenous Australians as we talk about community development.
Yep.
Can you tell us about how those two things maybe intertwine?
Sure. I think this is a really important area to get some fundamentals in place first. And we've set out some principles that really underpin our relationship with Aboriginal people and communities and our programs in that area. The first one is a non-negotiable, passionate commitment to enhance the opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employment in Red Cross. We've come from a very low base to now having the order of 130 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander employees, doing some amazing work, literally from Broome to Cairns, right across the country, and it's a source of great pride to the organisation. Second thing that we say is that we're going to be there for the long haul. I think there's too many examples of organisations or governments getting in, then moving out of community engagement after a short period of time. We have to be there for the long haul according to the need. Third thing is that the last thing that we're going to be doing is simply expanding our work in this area unless we're welcomed, supported and endorsed in our role by the local community, and ideally that we can form partnerships with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. And so that's a major core principle, a series of principles which underpin our work. But I'm optimistic. Obviously, I have a deep personal commitment to this area, but I should say that the transformation in Red Cross has been driven by our board, by our senior management and our staff at all levels of the organisation. It's a real change in the way that we focus in this area.
Fantastic. You're obviously very passionate about it. I just want to ask quickly one last question, and that is, what drove it? What's driving your passion? What's driving your board to say, this is where we're going now?
Well, I think it's untenable for an organisation committed to focusing on the most vulnerable people in this country not to be prepared to embrace and work as a high priority with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. How could we not be in this space, I guess is the question. On a personal level, I've had a long history of engagement with this space, starting off as a lawyer with the Aboriginal Legal Service back in my 20s, and then moving into some other roles which perhaps best not talked about.
On that note, we're going to wrap it up. Robert Tickner, thank you so much for joining us and for your passion to seeing a more just Australia and world.
Thank you.
Quite encouraging. There's more information about the Red Cross on our Facebook page, which you can check out at facebook.com/Just Salvos, or of course our website, www.justsalvos.com. You may be interested in some new recent blog updates we've got up there at the moment. We're going to be back with you next week. Only a few shows left for this year. Catch you later.